Coloring books for adults. In case you haven't heard, it's a thing right now. Publishers were coming out with all kinds of books with pictures for adults to color, with crayons no less. Admittedly, the pictures are much more intricate and complex than the duckies and horsies found in a child's coloring book, but it's still a coloring book. By the way, I suggest you don't do what I did this week, where I went on the internet and searched for adult coloring books. I came up with titles I can't mention in the pulpit. If you're interested, I suggest you Google coloring books for adults. Now, the proponents of coloring books for adults claim certain psychological benefits for this activity. It's supposed to relax your brain by entering into a kind of meditative state. It's supposed to relieve stress and anxiety. Unplugging from technology is supposed to promote creativity over consumption, as well as expel negative thoughts. Somebody after the early service was telling me that her mother, who is slipping farther and farther into dementia, still loves to color in these coloring books, and it calms her mind. Now, I think that's wonderful. And if any of those things can be helpful to any of us, then coloring books for adults is a worthwhile endeavor, because creativity can be a coping skill. Perhaps that's why the pages of Matthew 2 have, metaphorically speaking, been colored in as much as any coloring book. I can't think of a single biblical story that has been pushed beyond the narrative boundaries more than this one. It hasn't just been colored in. For 2 millennia, Christians have been coloring outside the lines of this story as well. And the place where the biblical story ends and the accretions of the centuries is lost on most people. Some of you may remember me telling about the time at my Rotary Club meeting when a lady in the club was asking Christmas trivia questions in an attempt to elicit money out of each person. And when she came to the table next to mine, she asked, what were the names of the 3 kings who visited the Christ child? And of course, they hemmed and hawed, and somebody came up with Larry, Moe, and Curly. But they finally wound up having to fork over $1 apiece because nobody could come up with Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar. And the lady was just about to turn to the next table when I couldn't stifle myself any longer, and I piped up and asked, so how do we know there were only 3? Some of you may remember that sound when you used to jerk a needle off of a record all of a sudden. That's what that room sounded like. It went just dead silence. And finally the poor lady stuttered, well, it's in the Bible. And I said, no, it's not. Matthew just says wise men from the east. There could have been 2, 3, a dozen, maybe a whole crowd. Plus, Matthew never calls them kings, and he certainly doesn't give them any names. As I was leaving the meeting, one guy came up to me and said, it really doesn't say there were 3 wise men? And I said, no. Read the Bible sometime. It'll shed a lot of light on the Christmas story. I know it was snarky, but I couldn't resist. The church has worked overtime to color outside the lines of this story. Not only have we said there were 3 wise men and we've turned them into kings and given them names, but we've made each one a different color and ethnicity. We've turned the star at its rising into a blazing light in the night sky, which of course would have been seen by a lot more people than just the wise men and would have terrified the entire population to boot. We even placed them at the manger in Bethlehem when Matthew only tells us about a house. There is even a story about the 3 magi living their lives as tireless champions of the gospel, and then when they're all centenarians, they meet for one last Christmas reunion in Armenia and then die within a few days of each other. Did you hear any of that in the story? Of course you didn't. It's all colored in. It's all added on. It's attached like barnacles to the narrative. And I confess to have taken a bit too much erudite pride over the years ripping those barnacles off people's nativity sets. But I was chastised a bit when I came across a discussion of this story by the late, great biblical scholar Raymond Brown. Brown was an incredibly brilliant biblical scholar, and he knew this text in Matthew inside and out. And he claimed that coloring in this story is precisely what Matthew hoped would happen. Matthew, Brown claims, invites one's imagination to take off into unknown territory simply by making this story so exotic to begin with. You see, he builds on Isaiah's assertion that nations shall come to your light and kings to the brightness of your dawn. And Matthew has Gentiles coming to the Christ child, but these aren't just your ordinary run-of-the-mill Gentiles. These are astrologers, magicians from somewhere in the mystical East who show up with horoscopes and fragrant aromatics and strange religion. Their arrival as well as their identity raises more questions than it answers. They are so exotic that this story cries out for creative embellishment. Because that's what we do with anyone we encounter who doesn't fit our known categories. We tend to imbue them with all kinds of characteristics and backstories. When I was in high school, a family from Pennsylvania moved into a house up the street from us. They had 2 boys about my age, and so I started hanging around with them. Now, I knew where Pennsylvania was on the map, but I'd certainly never met anybody from Pennsylvania. I certainly had never been there before. In my small southern hometown, everybody looked and sounded like I did, and so these guys were oddities. One of them was a gymnast. I didn't even know the word gymnast, much less know what a gymnast did. And they talked so funny. They insisted on pronouncing the words like pen and hen and ben, when everybody who's civilized know you say those words like hen, pen, and ben. Plus, they were Roman Catholics. And my Southern Baptist upbringing imagined them carrying rosaries in their back pockets and adoring a statue of Mary on the kitchen counter. I knew I wasn't supposed to like Yankees, but I was strangely drawn to these boys. They were so different from anyone I had ever met. Now, Matthew draws the Magi from the East like those brothers from Pennsylvania. They are so exotic, they almost demand imaginative embellishments. You see, the story of the Magi cracks open the story of Jesus and invites us to imagine the unimaginable, to color outside the lines of our lives, to envision the very kind of world Jesus talked about when he spoke of prodigals welcomed home and outsiders welcomed inside and resurrection emerging from crucifixion. Matthew wants us to use the story of the Magi as a springboard for seeing a whole new world, to give us the courage to look beyond the values of Washington, Wall Street, Main Street, and Hollywood. And let's face it, compared to the outlandish claims of the gospel, the weird Magi from the East look about as exotic as a bologna sandwich. But you have to start somewhere. So, in the year 2017, I invite you to color in the story of your life, like the church has colored in the story of the Magi over the centuries. Have fun with it. Break the rules. Color outside the lines. Use a green crayon for the sky and a purple crayon for the ground. Don't be bound by the old conventions. Take the risk of stepping outside your comfort zone to do something unexpected. Envision something new, something bold, maybe even something scandalous. At least it might look scandalous to the hidebound status quo. Imagine the unimaginable. Claim the impossible to be possible. Resolve to attain the unattainable and reach the unreachable. Our creative God has created us with the capacity to be creative. Let's use it to envision a bright future instead of the anxiety-ridden future everybody else is talking about these days. Now, does that sound crazy? It's no more crazy than coloring 3 kings beside the manger. And you didn't have any qualms about putting them in your nativity set, now did you? Some of you may remember me telling you that the first home I recall from my childhood had a big fenced-in backyard with an old wooden shed where my parents stored lawn equipment and assorted junk. My sisters and I, as well as our friends who came over, would often incorporate that old shed into whatever we happened to be playing in the backyard on a given day. But one day, one of us noticed a blob of dried paint on the side of that shed, possibly where somebody had cleaned out a paintbrush or something. And to our childish head, that spot of paint looked like the outline of a wolf's head. And it scared us. Because you see, we were erudite literary children. We knew the story of the 3 little pigs. We knew what had happened to Little Red Riding Hood. So after a while, we wouldn't go in the backyard anymore. When my mother got tired of dodging tricycles in the living room and ordered us out into the sunshine and fresh air, we explained to her we couldn't do it for fear of being eaten by the wolf. She said, "What wolf?" We said, "The wolf out in the backyard." She looked out in the backyard. "There's no wolf out there." We said, "Yeah, there is. Look on the shed." She said, "There's no wolf on the shed." And so realizing that grown-ups are old and can't see well, we summoned up all our courage and pointed to the hideous beast on the side of the shed. "Ah, that's just dried paint," Mother said. "No, it's a wolf." And no amount of adult logic could convince us otherwise. Now, those of you who have met my mom will not be surprised by what she did next. She scrounged a handful of crayons out of our toy box and said, "I'll take care of the wolf." And she marched out the back door. Now, we thought she must be either terribly brave or terribly stupid to go fight a wolf only with crayons, but we watched just the same. Well, she started drawing all over that blob of dried paint, switching from green to red to brown and other assorted colors. And as we watched, that wolf's head changed shape and then color. And we saw it transformed in just a few minutes, to our utter amazement, into a tree covered with luscious, red, ripe apples. Back door banged shut, and she said, "Now you can go out and play." And we did. The object of our dread had been erased. The beast that haunted the backyard had been vanquished, and we could get back to being children again. This year, color the story of your life by imagining the unimaginable. A wolf can become an apple tree, and the kingdoms of this world can become the kingdom of our Lord and of His Christ. Amen.